Good evening again. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Frank Lloyd. I am the president here at the Jefferson Educational Society. And welcome to another Thomas B. Hagen lecture here at the Jefferson in partnership with the Historical Society. So I'm here just to do a couple of small things. One of the things that I wanted to do is let you know about our housekeeping. Please shut off your phones if you have it on. It's always awkward when somebody's phone goes off, so, you know. The other thing is Q&A. You should have gotten an index card on your way in, and if you don't have one, raise your hand. Somebody will bring you one for the Q&A portion of tonight's talk. Please be mindful of your writing. We want Cal to be able to read your questions up there. And I also wanted to let you know about a few upcoming events. Tomorrow, we are at the Harbor Creek Municipal Building with Dr. Judy Lynch, who's written a book, if you didn't know. It's right here. It is 16 years worth of work in this book. It's the economic history of Northwestern Pennsylvania. And if you need to know something that happened in the economic history of our town, that's the book. So see Judy tomorrow night at 6 o'clock at the Harbor Creek Municipal Building. On Thursday, here at the Jefferson, we have Robert Spiel talking about U.S.-Canada relations, and he has just written a book that coincidentally came out a couple months ago with a fellow Canadian, or with a Canadian, so it should be interesting considering that's on top of everybody's mind. And on Friday at 11 o'clock, if you want to see something awesome, show up at the flagship City Hall down at the EDDC footprint on 6th and State, and join Drew Whitting as he explains what has happened with the EDDC and the type of development that's going down there. I do want to take a moment to thank one particular individual who this would not happen without, and that is Mr. Cal Pfeiffer. I know Cal from 2008 or 9, as we were both coming out of college, started working in Erie, and it's just so awesome to see his growth with the community and his leadership with the Hagen History Center. So without further ado, Mr. Cal Pfeiffer.
I was getting worried there for a minute. I thought he was going to tell everyone we've known each other since we were in diapers. Not quite. So great to have this turnout this evening. Thank you for attending. For those of you that are familiar with this lecture series, the Doris Becker lecture series takes place quarterly in partnership with the Jefferson. One of the lectures are dedicated to something Frank Lloyd Wright, and the other 3 are dedicated to something that connects with either Erie, the region's history, or even American history. So we started this year with the history of wine, doing a wine tasting from the macro level, looking at how the industry came to North America, all the way down to our Lake Erie wine region. We have, of course, tonight's architecture lecture, and next on deck will be June 25th. We're going to bring in a scholar that wrote his PhD dissertation at University of Pennsylvania on the Erie accent. Yes, there is an Erie accent, and he will tell us all about it. But for this evening, I've really been looking forward to this lecture for a while, and we're so appreciative that Kahn Architects out of Detroit can make it happen for us. The reason why I've wanted to focus on this particular topic is because 2 out of the three great American architects are right here in Erie on our campus, and we can interpret. We can talk about Richardson, since our mansion is in the Richardsonian style, and of course we have Frank Lloyd Wright's office. Little bit of a change in the program this evening. Kim Montague, the CEO of Kahn, the first woman CEO in their history, and they have a long storied history as a firm since 1895. She had a death in the family today as she was driving across from Detroit to Erie. So she had to go back to Detroit. We have the immediate past CEO, Alan Cobb, with us. And we also have Mike Giovanni, the senior project designer for Kahn. Kahn is not a stranger to Erie. They've been working with the Erie Downtown Development Corp on several of the buildings in the core of the city, and they were also the architect of record for the new Erie Insurance Tower, named after Tom Hagen, that debuted 4 years ago. So we're so pleased to have both gentlemen here. I'm going to turn it over, and the three of us will be back on stage for Q&A at the end. Gentlemen.
Why the best place today?
Thank you, Cal, and thank all of you for coming. I see a few familiar faces, and that's good. Mike and I have been doing work here in Erie, Pennsylvania for about 25 years. So we have developed a relationship, and we love Erie. This is a great topic. Cal, thank you so much for inviting us. We're happy to be here. These three architects have really affected all of us, all practicing architects in the United States and around the world, really. And so for us to sort of reinforce the history here and connect with the Hagen History Center, we think it's really very appropriate. We were going to the three of us take one of the architects. We thought that would be rather cute, but Kim had a problem, and you know, our heart goes out to her, and she sends her regrets to all of you. So Mike and I will pinch hit in this. We're 130 years old, as Cal mentioned. So our founder actually crossed over and had some connections to the three of these individuals. And while we're going to talk about the Trinity of American architecture, we've got a little surprise for you at the end. And so that's something we wanted to do. And you know, as we look at these three architectural powerhouses, they did pull from one another. And we hope to show that to you, to show how there's a thread that goes through all three of the careers of these individuals. And I think that you know, they did great things for America and for the U.S. You know, Henry Hobbs Richardson, as Cal said, is present here in the Richardsonian house being used by the Hagen History Center. He was born in 1838 and started his practice really after attending architecture school in 1865. He was born in St. James Parish in Louisiana. His grandfather was a doctor, a research person, and discovered the use of oxygen. And so he came from a wealthy family. He had the ability to attend engineering school at Tulane and Harvard, but decided to become an architect, and decided also that to do that, he needed to go to Europe and attend École des Beaux-Arts. He did that. It actually took him several times to go through the entrance exam process, but he spent about 5 years in Europe, and that really shaped his career. The Civil War came, and his family had some financial difficulty, which brought him back to the U.S., But he settled in the East Coast and set up practice in New York and continued to do and build a firm and really set a legacy. And I think when he came back, he wrote about becoming an American architect and setting the tone for American architecture. This first house he did was really a kind of a throwback, a mansard, a Second Empire style mansard roof, really French style. But as he got into the larger projects early in his career, churches, public buildings, you see the sort of heavy masonry, the use of stone and the arch, creating a solid kind of architecture. The Church of Unity in Springfield, Massachusetts is a good example of this, going all the way back to 1867. And he won a competition, did a number of churches, this one in Newton, Mass., again in the Richardsonian style of arches and heavy masonry. One of the things that HHR is definitely known for, and we see this all across the country, is really setting the tone for all of the buildings around railroads. And this is where, go back to his quote, and actually all three of the architects today use this. I've used this in my career: form follows function. And really looking at the way buildings are used, the functions that the buildings house, and designing so that they meet the functional needs. And he certainly did that with the railroads and the railroad work that he was involved in. And his stations basically were the model here, sprinkled around the East Coast and beyond Springfield, Massachusetts, offices and railway station. He set the tone with the large overhangs, hip roofs, and heavy masonry. He really set the tone for these kinds of buildings. We have a similar building in Ann Arbor, Michigan, that houses the railway station, and it's a lovely building. And you see this style, this vocabulary of architecture really coming through in both Sullivan and Wright. And Mike is going to get into the Wright connection, and he will draw the thread through that. But a lot of the bigger buildings that HHR was involved in had a similar kind of heavy masonry look with almost a Romanesque character. And here you see the use of symmetry with the two towers and the facade at the Buffalo State Asylum. And he, in this project and in much of his career, partnered with Frederick Law Olmsted, a great landscape architect, and they worked together and sort of shared design concepts coming from nature and sort of an organic way, a solid way of looking at architecture and connect it to the ground. Probably the most famous and my favorite, I should say, Henry Hobbs Richardson building is the Trinity Church in Boston, and it's rather appropriate. Cal mentioned Kim Montague being our CEO now. This year, she's receiving College of Fellows acceptance for the American Institute of Architects. She'll be a fellow in the American Institute of Architects, and she will be honored here in the Trinity Church actually in just a couple of weeks, and that's very appropriate. This is one of her favorite buildings as well. But he started and developed buildings in a kind of a symmetrical way with arches, as you find in the classics. And he began to depart from that in the work during his rather short practice. Here you see this house in Albany, New York, where it's an asymmetrical, really, that grew out of the functional characteristics of the house. We have a little jewel in Detroit that was designed by Henry Hobbs Richardson, the only building in Michigan designed by Richardson. This is a little fountain and a monument honoring the 16th governor of the state of Michigan, but just a little jewel in the city of Detroit. And he was involved in some international work, this one in England, for the Sullivan family, a mansion, just an incredible building, almost castle-like, but still departing from pure symmetry and a bit asymmetrical. And as he worked through his time practicing architecture, he simplified things. We see further simplification in the Emmanuel Episcopal Church here in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, a very simple building, almost modern, and clean, simple nave space, beautiful place. Actually, I just visited the Glessner House in Chicago a couple of months ago, and this is a stunning example of Richardsonian architecture, where for the founder of the International Harvester Company, John Glessner, wanted to protect his family in the city of Chicago, which was really a kind of a rough place. And so they hired Richardson and kind of built a wall, a fortress almost, around the house with a tranquil inner garden, inner courtyard for the family's use. And just a beautiful exterior granite facade with an interior, changing materials with limestone and brick on the interior courtyard. And probably the most famous piece of work that Henry Hobbs Richardson did, and one that influenced a lot of Chicago architecture, is the Marshall Field's warehouse. You know, all of Richardson's work was done with heavy masonry, with load-bearing masonry. Departed a little bit from that with the Marshall Field's warehouse. They had a few steel beams or steel plate girders in this facility to get larger spans, but the exterior of the building was heavy masonry. And there was limitations to the heavy masonry. You could only go so tall. The openings in the base of the building, the taller you go with masonry, the smaller the openings have to be. So it was limiting, although just a rich, beautiful building. Actually, Sullivan called this an oasis of architecture. So he felt, like this was a very important building. Moving on to really one of my favorite architects. I started my career in Chicago, spent several years, and so sort of the rich history of the Chicago style of architecture, the Prairie style, and these individuals that sort of built the lineage of architecture in Chicago are architects that I really admired. Louis Sullivan is one of those. He was a very brilliant young man. His mother was Swiss French and father Irish. He spoke several languages, fluent in French. He was born in 1856, and at age 16 was admitted to the School of Architecture at MIT. So he was a very smart kid, and he was very impatient and spent a little over a year in architecture school, but wanted to work, wanted to build. And he was very lucky to find a job with Frank Furness, a remarkable architect in Philadelphia. And Sullivan worked as a draftsman on the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts building in Philadelphia. Found that experience to be amazing. As the work slowed down in the city of Philadelphia, Louis Sullivan explored work in Chicago. So he traveled to Chicago. Chicago had just, before this, experienced the Big Fire, and in 1871. So it was a perfect place for an architect or a contractor to go to find an enormous amount of work. And Chicago was growing very rapidly. You can see that by the population growth. 1837, only 4,000 people in the city of Chicago. By 1880, 500,000, and 10 years later it doubled to 1 million. So a great place to be as an architect, and robust as it relates to the agriculture around Chicago. So he was hired by a wonderful mentor, William LeBaron Jenney. Jenney went to school in Paris, and actually was a classmate of Gustave Eiffel, designer of the Eiffel Tower. He was really more of a structural engineer than an architect, and perfect for training Louis in building, in Chicago, building quickly, building with new technology. Another very important mentor for Sullivan was John Edelman, who was an arts and crafts architect and was really strong in ornamentation and detail in the building. And they had a friendship that went on for many years. Sullivan realized that he really needed more architectural education, and so he went to Paris. He took the entrance exam and passed it on the first try at École des Beaux-Arts. He spent a year in Paris and toured Europe and was really influenced greatly, learned how to draw, learned how to sketch, and found Michelangelo as a real hero in his life and in his career, really joining the architecture and art together as one. And will follow him throughout his life as an architect. So after a little over a year at École des Beaux-Arts and in Europe, he came back to Chicago, and he found employment with Dankmar Adler. They were really made for one another in that Adler was a great businessman, a great builder, and he actually called Louis Sullivan the Irish man with ideas. So they hit it off very well, and within a 2-year period of time, Sullivan was made a full partner, and they changed the name to Adler Sullivan. They were involved a lot heavily in residential architecture in Chicago. And of course, with the population growth, there was a huge need for residential. Dankmar Adler had connections to the business community in Chicago and brought a lot of work to the firm. This was a mansion that was done for Anne Halstead. Henry Halstead was a shipping magnate and had one of the most lucrative shipping businesses around the Great Lakes, headquartered in Chicago. And when he died, she decided to invest in real estate, and they built hundreds of row houses. In fact, there's a whole street, Halstead, that is named after the family and still exists today and has this beautiful detail that Louis Sullivan brought to these buildings. The stone carving and brickwork is just stunning. But for Sullivan, this was kind of being in the perfect place at the perfect time, as the population growth and the business growth in the city of Chicago. Architects were needed to use the latest technology and advance things. The property was getting much more expensive. The need to go vertically was very important. And here you see the Ryerson building and the Jewelers building really reaching the max, about 6 stories, 5 to 6 stories for load-bearing masonry. And here they incorporated some iron columns in the facade, iron columns back in the bay to get greater spans. But it was really topped out. They needed to go further. They needed to step into a steel frame to get above the 6-story kind of limit to masonry construction. Actually, in the Marshall Field's warehouse, H.H. Richardson went 8 stories with masonry, but it's very difficult to do. So the Chicago architects convinced the steel makers, the steel mills in Pittsburgh and Pennsylvania and in southern Ohio to transition from making mild steel rails, the railroad industry, which was booming also, and convert that process to mild steel wide flange beams and I-beams for buildings. And that really unlocked the next generation of construction of the high-rise building. And that's part of the reason why Louis Sullivan is considered the father of the skyscraper and of modern architecture, because of his integration with new technology. And this building, the auditorium building right on Michigan Avenue in Chicago, was a great win for Adler and Sullivan. And you can see he borrowed from Henry Hobbs Richardson and the Marshall Field's warehouse for this auditorium building, this office, mixed-use kind of retail, and also within the building is this grand opera house. And the interior of the building was a great place for Sullivan to create the detail and incorporate the organic detail that is prevalent in all of his buildings. And so this sort of set the tone for the rest of his career. He also was involved heavily still with the housing industry, and Charnley was a lumber baron that was a good client for Adler Sullivan, and he did this Ocean Spring, Mississippi home for Charnley that he actually bought himself, and this became the home of his winter retreats with he and Margaret, his partner. And actually this particular house later was sort of claimed by Frank Lloyd Wright as his design, although historians feel that Sullivan would never have bought the house if it had been designed by Frank Lloyd Wright, but that remains to be seen. But so this time frame, 1890, is the point in time when the skyscraper was born. And Adler and Sullivan did a whole series of 10, 12, 14, 16-story buildings using a steel frame and masonry or terracotta facade. And Louis Sullivan really kind of perfected a lightweight terracotta, basically baked earth, to clad the steel buildings with, lightening up the loads on the steel frame so that you don't use stone, you use a material that doesn't have as much weight. And also he developed the client group that followed him, and so he would design their residence, he would design their place of business, and he would design their tomb. Here's the Wainwright tomb, the same Wainwright family. They called this the Taj Mahal of tombs in St. Louis, but just a beautiful little structure. And the Schiller building in Garrick Theater, a beautiful building designed by Sullivan, 16-story building, actually it's 17. This was the tallest building in the world for its time, 1891. And this building in 1961 was torn down to the chagrin of many architects in the city of Chicago today. And I quote Louis Sullivan, great architecture has only two natural enemies, water and stupid men. But because of the land cost and the need for growth in Chicago and other places, New York was facing the same sort of thing. Everybody was looking to the sky. Everybody was looking up. This building never was finished. The Trinity Temple Tower, 36-story building, pales by comparison to today's Burj Tower in Dubai that's 165 stories, but this was cutting edge. And the thing that I admire about this is that, you know, he developed these towers, and there are other similar towers that were built. The Empire State Building is, you know, has a pitched rooftop and has similar kind of stepping. But he also paid attention to the detail. Even the doorknobs are custom designed and have this beautiful sort of lacy, natural quality to that. Again, for the Charnley family, he designed a beautiful house. I was just by this house in Chicago. Again, he was a lumber baron. The wood that came to this house was spectacular wood, and Sullivan exploited it. Actually, this house is one that Frank Lloyd Wright claims he designed as well. But so there were a whole series of, as I said, these 14 to 16-story buildings. This one in St. Louis, beautiful building, Union Trust, in 1892. And in 1893, the World's Fair came to Chicago. And you may have read the books about the White City. But Louis Sullivan was in dismay over this. Burnham and Root firm in Chicago was given the lead for this World Exposition. And there were also East Coast architects involved in deciding what the architectural character would be. And they chose a European classical character for the architectural vocabulary. Louis Sullivan was stunned. He claimed that this move set American architecture back 5 decades. It might be true, I'm not sure, but he was given the design of the transportation building. He used a Romanesque style for this with a very nice scale to the base. And again, looking at form follows function, there were basically mostly rail cars and railroad implements in this building, just a beautiful building. At the same time, Sullivan was designing the Chicago Stock Exchange building, 14 stories, a similar methodology, steel frame with terracotta and masonry cladding. And unfortunately, this building in 1971 was demolished, and so it's been lost. And they saved the arch. They saved in fact, if you go to the Chicago Institute of Art, you'll see the Stock Exchange arch. Just beautiful interior details. In Buffalo, similar kind of building, formula, 14 stories, the Guardian building. This building still exists and is just absolutely stunning. So this is 1895. At this point in time, Frank Lloyd Wright, who apprenticed under Sullivan, was fired. Mike Giovanni is going to get into that a little bit more. But this is when Sullivan and Adler parted ways. So the firm was split over some dispute. Actually, it's very sad. Adler died at only 56 in 1900, but so he made attempts to get back with Louis Sullivan, and that never happened. Louis went on to do what he considered to be his finest building in New York City on Bleecker Street. Actually, this building still exists. I was there a few years ago. It was restored about 25 years ago. This is a terracotta facade, incredible building. This building was housing publishers and printing process, and so Sullivan used the Angel details, the flourish at the top, really the winged messenger at the top that relates, and it's just an incredible amount of detail on a building, but a magnificent thing to see. He started simplifying all of this, though, and the buildings in Chicago and other cities began to pull back from the decoration, this being a very modern kind of style here, the Gage Building right on Michigan Avenue in Chicago. And probably my favorite Sullivan building is the Schlesinger Meyer building. This is actually Carson Perry Scott now, if you've been there and seen this. This is 1903. It's kind of Art Deco. It feels Art Deco. Very simple. There's a base of detail, but the expression of the structure above is a very modern kind of facade treatment with a Chicago Bay window, the picture window and the two operable windows on either side. But incredible detail on the inside. That's what you see with Sullivan's work. It has a finesse about it, and that added sort of ornamentation and organic detail that is just beautiful. Getting into the 1900s, the really first 20 years, Sullivan's practice began to fall off a bit, and he ended up doing a number of residential projects, and he developed the Chicago style or the Prairie style and was credited with that. But he did a number of houses with developers that had this Prairie style. And many of these houses are mistaken for Frank Lloyd Wright houses, and they were designed, of course, by Louis Sullivan. And there's many of them. And as his work really kind of matured and got to the later stages of his life, the buildings got more simple. And this is an office building in 1911. This kind of building, this ribbon window office building, you would have seen in the 80s and 90s. It's really kind of timeless. But the branch banks are also one of my favorite parts of Sullivan's career. Throughout the Midwest and for the agricultural community, he did a series of small banks that are just little jewel boxes. And many architects in the Midwest have picked up and been influenced by these beautifully detailed object buildings. And in fact, our founder, Albert Kahn, in the work he did in the institutional work, it had a lot of decoration and detail that was similar to these buildings with Louis Sullivan. Stunning buildings and beautiful interiors as well. His last building in 1922, as his practice kind of deteriorated, is the Krause Music Store in Chicago. I've been there. It's a beautiful building, terracotta facade. And in 1924, Louis Sullivan passed, and he was found in a hotel living penniless. It's really a sad story, an amazing career with a rather kind of brutal ending. But the architects of Chicago actually came together, honored him, gave him the gold medal, the AIA National Gold Medal, and helped bury him. But a beautiful legacy. Michael.
Thank you, Alan. That was great, and good evening.
Yes.
I want to point out that Frank Lloyd Wright had another 35 years of his career to develop his architecture. And what was going on was American journalists like Emerson, writers were saying, where's the American architecture? Where's American art? And so all three of them were taking that challenge. But in Wright's work, we had more time to develop. He came up with the ideas of reducing ornamentation, but he did that through his ideas of organic architecture, which meant attachment to nature, free-form planning, and the use of nature and materials, the nature materials, as he would say. So the family came and they settled in Wisconsin in what they called the Valley. And Wright grew up there and went on to Chicago, with the fire, as Alan had mentioned, gave great opportunities for young architects. And he'll return to the Valley, as you'll see, as he goes through his life. All right, so in this search for a lack of a reduction in ornamentation and simplicity in architecture, both Richardson and Sullivan were looking for moving away from the strong asymmetrical qualities of the buildings, both in planning and in elevation. And you can see here the Richardson Ames Harrison building up there in Boston is really quite interesting, that Richardson was really already stripping his buildings from heavy ornamentation. In fact, I look at the top and I see mid-century modern in the top of that building, which I find quite fascinating. But the project for the casino, it's an example of this kind of a symmetrical, equilateral development in the planning, and Wright was going to break that with his free-forming architecture. This house that you see here, this is his first home and studio. So on the right side of the image is the house that, in fact, he got a $5,000 loan from Sullivan to start his home, and then the section on the left is a studio. So what you see here in the development in the Robert Payne house by Richardson, and he worked with Olmsted, famous landscape designer at the time, this layering of the topography with the building. And Wright saw that as an opportunity. Now, Oak Park was flat, but he still developed this ideas of this plinth, which the house sat on. But his evolution in his design is that plinth would become attached to the site and would bring in his ideas about nature and architecture. You can see in the upper image on the left there, the red lines are that, primary axis. And he started developing secondary or cross axes to spread the house across the site. So in the bottom there, the Robert Parker house and the Walter Gale house, this is what Alan was mentioning. So Sullivan was very busy with those large projects that Alan was showing you. And so as an apprentice, Wright got to do these houses in Oak Park. And so the story is that Sullivan was out driving one Sunday and saw these two houses and said, "Those look like my houses." And he had no idea of that. It turns out that Frank Lloyd Wright was getting quite a reputation for doing houses in Oak Park, and he was moonlighting those. And so there was an argument over a few days, which eventually resulted in Wright leaving the office. The Thomas house in the corner is known. Lower corner is known as his first Prairie house. So what the Prairie house is very interesting because Wright starts to look at the idea of reducing the basement, no basement, and starting to reduce the access of the attic, eliminating the attic. So it allowed the roof lines to get much flatter, as you can see. So this is one of his early houses, the Winslow house in Oak Park, and you can see the axial and cross-axial development. But what's also interesting about this is in the center image, it's very formal to the street, and that's something that Richardson was doing. Earlier we looked at the Glensner house, and this is the backyard elevation you see there. But the idea of a very formal looking building on the street, and then in the lower left there, you see how the house has now become more of a private zone where they start to have not so much strict geometry in the elevation. You see projections, you see the hexagonal tower, stair tower in the design. And so you see that kind of development of, of the influence of Richardson on Wright's architecture. So this is one of the first houses that Wright did after he left the Sullivan office. It's quite interesting here that you see that in the Crane Memorial Library in Massachusetts. You can see the asymmetrical designs that were starting to develop for Richardson. He was breaking away from that really strong symmetrical architecture and started creating this layering in the building. So Wright's Hertley house is interesting for a couple of reasons. It starts to pick up that idea of the plinth relating to the site. you can see the archway, the similar archways at the entrance. But Wright had a Unitarian upbringing, and in the Unitarians, they really talked about in their religion the importance of the family and privacy for the family, not only for family activities, but for the work environment as well. So you see the prow that's sticking out here on the building, excuse me, on Wright's building on the right. And what it's saying is that, this is a private residence. It's starting to protect the entrance. And you'll see the evolution of this idea as we move forward. So his planning principles of eliminating the basement were starting to create private and service spaces on the first floor, and then lifting the family spaces, the living rooms, dining rooms, kitchens to the second floor to create that level of privacy. So the thought was, I'm going to raise this above the street, so as there's family activities going on, you can't really see into the house from the street. The Susan Dana house is a good example of Wright's evolution in his architecture. It's interesting, it's one of the few houses where he has this open gables on the ends of the buildings. And also, it's really interesting in the upper left there that he has an entrance with that Richardsonian archway that's fully exposed to the street. So you can see he's starting to experiment with how you approach the houses. It is, the center plan that you see there with the major axes and cross axes and the buildings expanding or stretching across the site is his way to connect to the site and bring nature into the house. At the same time, he was doing some commercial buildings. So his family was going to the Unitarian Church in Oak Park, and one night it was in a storm struck by lightning and burned to the ground. So it gave Wright the opportunity he was commissioned to do the church. So he had a fascination with concrete. So he ended up doing this building out of concrete forms. It's interesting and some of you might be aware of this, when you build a concrete structure, you have concrete forms, you can put a retarder on the face of it so that when you pull it off, the face of the concrete comes off. And what that does is it creates an exposure of the stone, gravel that's in the concrete, and it gives you a stone-like texture. And Wright experimented with that and created that for this building. So one of the things that he talks about was this idea of compression and expansion. And you'll see this in several of the buildings we're going to look at. So the church that was there, the main door is right on the street. You could walk up the main steps into the church. The idea here is that you can't really find the entrance. It's very difficult to find the entrance for the ideas about privacy. So they created some of the architecture elements where it hides the stairs up to the forecourts off the street, and hidden. So this was this idea of privacy in their buildings. So the sense of compression was developed in that idea, but that when you filtered through the building, and that lower right image, there's a stairway in the right, and that's something that I experienced when I went there. As you come through this compression area through small hallway into this thin stair. Limited stair, and then it opens up into the sanctuary. So you get this sense of compression and release, and Wright was using that to create a sense of arrival. So he was also looking at some other commercial buildings, and this is the building for the Larkin Soap Company, and you can see his very limited amount of ornamentation in the building. He wanted to use ornamentation very purposefully, and then he limited it to the columns. Well, this building also was known for its technology. It was one of the earliest air-conditioned buildings. He also wanted to protect the sanctity of the worker, so he created these heavy elements in the corners, which became mechanical spaces, mechanical shafts, and toilet rooms. And this building uses the first time that toilet room partitions were hung from the ceiling, which from a maintenance standpoint, you can clean the partitions without legs on the floor. But the court that you see in the center lets natural light in a sense. He wanted to protect the workers like he's protecting the families. So one of his early prairie houses is the Willits house, and this was one of Albert I'm sorry, this is one of Frank Lloyd Wright's favorite buildings. And you can see the development of, the axis and cross axis. But there's a lovely relationship between this idea of these platforms and the vertical elements that are integrated with that. So there's this element of what Wright started to call plasticity. So plasticity meant that I'm going to take the exterior elements, bring them within the building. So there's a unification between exterior and interior. And so you can see that in the woodwork in particular when you're experiencing the interior spaces. The amount of wood they used in the wall, the lacing of the wood, created that connection of wall, ceiling, and floor. And they called that plasticity. So the Avery Cooley house was important to Wright too, because his connection to nature, and he was continuously exploring that in his ideas of organic architecture, was the use of water. So there's a couple of reflecting pools on the house, and he liked to see his buildings reflected into the water, but it was also a reminder that we are connected to nature. Another one of his favorites was the Martin House in Buffalo. So his prairie style was not only in Oak Park, it was starting to emerge across the country. And he liked this building in particular because it was a complex building where he could really explore the axial and cross-axial development across the larger site, and then bringing plant life inside. And then you can see the relationship of these horizontal elements against the vertical elements. So there's a great balance there. You can almost see those heavy corners that was in the Larkin office building. So this building also does a great job in protecting the entrance. It's hard to find the entrance. The stairs are hidden, the front doors are hidden, but that was part of this concept of privacy. And in conjunction with that, he would use the concept of compression and release that mentioned on the other buildings. It's become something that's very obvious in his buildings. So you come into low areas with low ceilings, and it opens up into the more living spaces. The one thing that's interesting about this house is that the Roman brick that he loved quite a bit is brought inside. That's developed on the exterior, and they also had some type of polishing of the mortar joints, gilding of the mortar joints that made it reflective. So the house had this wonderful kind of reflectivity to it when you pass by the house. So probably the most world famous building is the Roby House, the Prairie School of Frank Lloyd Wright in Chicago. In the upper left drawing, they talk about how this building is almost like a lake freighter that you saw all over the Great Lakes in Michigan and Chicago area. So they talk about how this banding at the bottom, these stacked layers of horizontality, was like this ship on the water, be it land. And then the opening up of the building as the building rises becomes lifts into space. And then you get these stripped windows, which provides lots of glass into the space. So on the lower left, that dark spot way there in the back, that's the entrance. So Wright was always about this kind of idea of privacy and then the compression. So the second photo over is the foyer that you walk into. But the first floor, again, is mostly, I'm going to take a turn for a second, is mostly private spaces and service spaces. And then the stairway beckons you up, and as you move up into kind of a breezeway there in the far right photo, and then up above that on the upper left, you kind of break into the living spaces, which are on the second floor. So in doing the research about Wright and looking at him, I always thought that just kind of a reinvention. He's always reinventing himself. Again, he had another 35 years of his career beyond the other two, and so he could do a lot more exploration. He had closed the office in 1909, moved to Germany for 2 years, and in that time, he spent a lot of time with the successionist art movement and architecture. And what they were all about was using the last bastions of primitive architecture and decoration to inspire them in their buildings. The thing is, what the reinvention of Wright is that he controls the amount of ornamentation that's used and makes it very purposeful. And then he started to decide that, the ornamentation of the house is really becomes in advances form about circles, angles, and octagonal shapes. And you can see that in the beginning of some of his early work. He was also, at the same time, for his organic architecture, looking at plant life. So the sumac was important to him, and he would use that as inspiration for his art glass windows that you see there. So we leap ahead a little bit to the California movement for Wright. So Wright saw the expansion of California and things that were going on in Los Angeles in particular. And he also had a desire to use machine manufacturing. So the Europeans, architects and modernists were talking about the machine as, houses as a machine for living. And Wright took that more as, how can I build the houses more economically? Because he's beginning to discover that through his thinking that he wants to provide housing for the average American, because he was accused of, doing these wonderful houses for the wealthy. And so we'll talk about the Usonian house in a moment. But in California, it's interesting that he took the concrete block and he said, I want to take the concrete block and glorify it. And what he meant by that was that you take the average materials. In fact, the blocks were made on the site. There was 27,000 of them. And he would add some ornamentation to them to make them more significant. But in this house, when you visit it, you get this idea of compression when you enter the entrance and you go up to the stairs and to this corridor that you see there in the lower left. And then it expands space along public and private spaces along that corridor. And so you get this sense of compression and then the surprise of the release and arrival when you come into the living spaces of the building. At the same time, he was thinking that this building really needs to respond to the Los Angeles culture and the culture of speculation, monumentality, and he thinks that the house does that quite well. And this house has been used in a number of sci-fi movies over the year. Probably one of the most significant is the Blade Runner movie from 1980, and you can see this house in that movie. So again, one of the probably most famous buildings for Wright is the Kaufman summer house. So the Kaufmans were owners of the Kaufman department store in Pittsburgh, and they asked Wright to look at their site and do their summer house. Well, he had this commission for 9 months, and he had done nothing with it. And so the Kaufmans called the office, said that we're in town. We'd like to come by and see the progress. So within 3 hours, and this was kind of an amazing story about this, Wright had conceived this, drawn it up, and got the renderings done by the time they got to the office. Yes. So that's a great story. So the Kaufmans reacted and they said, well, we expected the house on the side of the ravine so we could watch the waterfall all day. But Wright's thoughts about the connection of nature, and part of that connection of nature was that every house should be particular to its site that can be built nowhere else. And they had quite an opportunity to do that in this site. So he built it on top of the waterfall, obviously, and it's been called kind of, a layer of cantilevers, city of cantilevers, rather. And you can see that in the lower kind of right image, there's a stairway down to the waterfall, the stairway down to nothing, as they call it, but it goes down to the water, and you could sit there and contemplate, watch the water go over the waterfall from that position. And then just to the right of it was a plunge pool. So Mrs. Kaufman would like to go down every morning and jump into the plunge pool. So he, again, used this idea of compression. I'm going to bring you into the house, through the hidden ways through the site to get to the house, into a small cramped foyer, up some cramped thin stairs, and then explode into the space like this that you see here. And so Wright also used lots of windows, continuous windows, because his connection to nature was about beckoning you to want to go out, look out those views, look out into the trees, and step out onto the balconies. So here's a couple of images on houses of his attempts to create the Unisonian house. So the idea was for $5,000, you could have one of these great Wright houses and make it affordable for most Americans. So the one on the top, this is interesting that he started to use, I mentioned, the angular and octagonal grids, and he was thinking that's the decoration for his buildings. That's the geometry that's driving the architecture. He liked that octagonal grid because it allowed him to wrap the building around the hill that you see here in the middle image. So the idea was with this kind of kit house is it could go on any site anywhere, but he also, had that philosophy about each house to be really particular to its site. And he thought that this grid concept would allow him to wrap that building and wrap that house around a site, wrap it through the topography. Again, you can constantly see this idea of plasticity of elements on the exterior moving to the interior. I always thought that the use of the wood in particular gives you that kind of plastic feeling because it's tying everything together. The floor is tied to the walls and to the ceiling. I think as you can see there in the upper right photo. Wright got another opportunity to do a major office building for the Johnson Wax Company, and the center photo shows what's been called the mushroom columns or the lily pad columns or the lollipop columns. But the critics say that this is a great example of the cathedral of American office space, the way that this is designed. So there's not a lot of windows with direct view that we kind of talked about in the other houses. So to understand that, Wright was saying that this site was surrounded by heavy industrial buildings at the time. So he didn't want the office workers to look out onto that. For the sanctity of the office workers, he wanted to keep them a bit protected from that. So the glass tubing, the Pyrex glass tubing that he used, kind of filtered the light, didn't necessarily give you a direct view outside, but he used it at the corners or at the top of the walls. So it gave a sense of kind of floating, the floating that we saw in the horizontal aspects of his prairie houses. And one thing to mention is that the local building department was very nervous about these columns, these lollipop columns. So they actually had one built and they put 6 tons of sandbags on top of it to see how much weight it would take. And 6 tons was twice the target loading for the design of the column itself. So it was able to take twice the load. So they were quite convinced that it'll be okay. So this fascination Wright had with the horizontality is turned vertically in the tower. And I find this quite interesting that he found a way to use it vertically. So in the lower left image of the tower, he alternates a full floor to the glass and then mezzanines. So you get these floating floors. So you get this idea of this kind of floating elements in the vertical dimension. Then Wright was asked to do a house for the Johnsons, and it was the wing spread house. He liked this because he finally was getting some large projects where he could take the axial development of the house and spread it across a larger site, because he thought that the house spread across the site is connecting to the house, is connecting to nature and bringing nature within. So this building is also known for this, in the center photo there, this kind of upturned pagoda look, and you see the fireplace inside. So it's a famous view that you see quite often when you see examples of Wright's work. But there is a circular staircase that goes up along the side to what's called the Hawk's Nest. So in the center, that's actually that glass area in the center top is actually a treehouse. So they developed that or put that in the design for the kids so they could have a treehouse to get up and look over the site. The cantilever building that you see on the lower right photo is actually the daughter's suite. So the organic architecture allowed Wright to really apply his thinking to different regions and different environmental conditions. So they had, when Wright came back to the United States, he created what they called Taliesin in Wisconsin. So Taliesin means shining brow. So that was important to Wright because he always thought that the house should be part of the hill, not on top of the hill. And so his organic architecture he used that at Taliesin West because they also at this time wanted a summer residents. The family was getting a bit tired of the cold Wisconsin winters, and they wanted to be able to get away. So at Taliesin in Wisconsin, and then again here in the West, he created the fellowship. And that's why you see the drafting room there in the lower center. But the building angular qualities of it, really are inspired. Wright was inspired by the mountains and the rocks in the mountains surrounding the site. And then they also used what they called desert masonry, where they took the boulders that were actually on the site, put it into a concrete matrix, and created the walls that you see there. Wright continued on with his exploration of different geometries. And here he begins a fascinating kind of journey in using the circle. So his thought was the ramp transcends space and time as you move up through the house. And then that ramp actually controls the geometry of the house. And the ramp ends at the master bedroom, which you see that's cantilevering in the lower center picture. And then also on the lower left, you see the ramp continues up into the terrace. There's a terrace on top of the house. So Wright was getting really interested again in concrete construction, and he used concrete columns and concrete cantilevers to create the floor structure. But his son was working at a block manufacturing company, and so that's why you see the use of the block in the house. But it's supported by these concrete cantilevers. So Wright was having a lot of concern and arguments with the Europeans in terms of the international style of architecture, especially in high-rise construction. So in high-rise construction, they were creating basically glass boxes. So the elevations were the same on every side. And in fact, Wright would call them the glass box boys, where he said, it's not organic. My architecture is organic. So in his tower, he uses the angular grid that you can see in the plan. But what he's saying is that the building needs to be different on every side. And why is it different? Well, because it needs to relate to the environment, to the views, and in particular, how the sun tracks around the building. He got an opportunity to do a large building in Marin County late in his life. And here's where he really got, the opportunity to work with concrete. He liked the idea that concrete, you could create curves and counter curves and arches and circles. And he was really fascinated by that material. And in fact, he talked about using materials in the nature. And that's what he used concrete for forming this building. It's interesting to note that the building also has two sections of it that are separated by a light well. So as we saw in the Larkin building, that light well comes back in later work and allows natural light to find its way down into the office spaces. Well, this all comes together in one of probably his most famous building, the Guggenheim Museum in New York City. And here's where he got the opportunity to use concrete to create cantilevered forms and circular forms. And the organic architecture, and even in the planning, his thinking was that, you bring people to the top first. And because it's it ramps down to the grade that you don't want people walking up. It's not organic. It's organic to start at the top and walk down. But he also liked the idea that, in that right image, that's the galleries. You don't see much of the artwork because they're just off to the edges, but that in fact is the continuous gallery. So I like the idea that you could see the art that you're looking at. You could see the art that's coming around the circle. You could look back at the artwork that you just passed by. You can look across the circle to see what's coming next or what you passed by. So he liked that about the building. So Wright was shunned by the business and architectural community in New York City. And he almost got the last word in this because this is really one of the most recognizable buildings in New York, and it's his only building. So he's got this, curvilinear building, cantilever building that's surrounded by a cacophony of angular, architecture. And it was always thought as very kind of quite successful in the last word for him on that issue. So Wright always said, study nature, love nature, stay close to nature, it will never fail you. And I think that what his point was is that he always thought that, when he was talked about religion and he was asked questions about religion, he'd always say, we can physically we can see God in nature. The nature is God in his opinion, and he wanted to bring nature into all of his buildings. So Alan mentioned the surprise. As the fourth American architect and the founder of our company. So Albert started his practice in Detroit in 1895, and he's had a really interesting career. We're up to 21,000 buildings. He has a great legacy because in the late 40s, 42, he passed away, but by then he created a board of directors so that quite often, an architect like Frank Lloyd Wright or Yamasaki, some of these great architects, once they pass away, their offices fade away because they don't pass the baton. So Albert was very good about that, creating a board of directors, creating a bunch of guys that could take over and move the company forward. And we're still here today after 135 years. 135 years and 21,000 buildings. So Albert really got his start with the auto industry. The auto industry was looking for innovative designer that could start to provide buildings that, could handle the weight of the machinery and the presses and the cars. And we see Albert was, and Kahn was selected for that, for the ingenuity and engineering construction that we could provide. The Ford River Rouge plant, the glass plant, is interesting because we affectionately call it the cat's ears. But what that is it's a way to bring natural light and airflow through the building. And so many of the buildings in Wright's, in Albert Kahn's development has showed this element. So the Willow Run plant, and that's very familiar to us. It's in Ypsilanti near Detroit. It's famous for building one B-24 bomber an hour during World War II. And the story is that, those bombers would come off the assembly line, they'd gas them up, fly around the building a couple times, and then take off for Iceland on their way to Europe. The Chrysler half-ton truck plant is very important in that it uses the glass curtain wall. So the Bauhaus, which started the modern movement in Germany, they looked at Kahn's work, and they looked at the glass curtain wall, and they began to use that in the development of their Bauhaus building, which became a school to educate architects on modernism. Our home is in the Fisher Building in Detroit, and we like to say that Fisher Building also influenced, and I think you can see it, the Empire State Building. So it was built in 1929. It just took over a year to build it, and you can see the interior space there. So this was one of three buildings. This is a 29-story building. There was going to be a 60-story building in the center, and then another 29-story building on the opposite end. The Cadillac Place, which is across the street, that was GM's world headquarters that we did. And what's interesting to note about that is that the legs or the arms that you see of the thin office towers was a way, especially back when it was built, to bring natural light and natural air close to the office workers. So thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Good. Sure that. Yeah.
Should be.
Okay.
You all were an inquisitive bunch tonight. They have a whopping 2 questions in front of them. So
There's another one.
we're going to have to ad-lib this one a little bit. So I guess to start, to tie your presentation in together, which thank you again, that was a lot of material to cover and over a great span of time. Prior to the three architects, really the four, particularly Richardson, who was the earliest one, because we say that they started American architecture. Were we really just copying European architecture?
Without a doubt. And yeah, I think that H.H. Richardson in particular, he had a mission to evolve beyond that. He spent a lot of time in Europe. He understood the classics, as did Sullivan, and they wanted something that was new and responded more to function and was about the things, the values of America. Yeah.
So would just as one example, as a follow-up of that, like a McKim, Mead, and White that did the big East Coast mansions, would they fall into that category of basically taking that European style? And
they absolutely did, yeah. And another Hunt is another name that actually was very influential in pushing the Columbian Exposition in Chicago, the 1893 World's Fair, into more of a classical kind of architectural vocabulary. Biltmore House, or it all came from previous buildings in Europe.
That's fascinating. It was they were trailblazers essentially, but I guess that's why we're here tonight celebrating them.
Well, can I add?
Yeah.
So when Wright was there and he was visiting the exposition, he was drawn to the Japanese exposition that was kind of out of the way that it was placed. It was on the island out in the lake, but he was drawn to that because the simplicity of it, and he thought it was organic, that the Soji screen concept that you could move around responds to the family's needs over time. So he liked that idea, that kind of organic notion of how the buildings were used and designed.
Little pivot, different question. Talk about you guys for a second. You've been coming to Erie for a long time. I'm curious, both of your individual answers, what architecture do you like in our community? You're not allowed to say your own buildings.
No, I think Erie is in a lot of ways similar to Detroit, and in that Detroit really benefited by not taking older buildings down. During the late 70s and through the 80s, cities like Chicago and Atlanta and New York City, for that matter, they took a lot of buildings down, and they didn't appreciate the history that was involved in the older architecture, and as a result of that, they lost some richness. And Detroit maintained that. Actually, now we're bringing a lot of it back in Detroit. And I think Erie has that ability as well, to take in, and the things that have been done on 6th Street are just absolutely amazing. And taking the old Boston store and other buildings on State Street, reconditioning, I think, and reusing, finding adaptive ways of reusing is what I think is really good about Erie. It could be, the future.
Mike?
Well, yeah, that's a great question. So, in the Mr. Hagen building on the Erie campus, we're trained as architects, and we study these various architects in our career, and we, look at periodicals and see what's going on and what's developing. And you maybe sometimes don't realize how you're influenced. But now, as I, doing this recent study on Wright, and I think about the building, I think there's organic things about it. One of the things that's really appreciated by the community is that building doesn't overpower the park. And so when we were designing that building, we had this notion of the lower building on the park, and that the building could rise up higher, because the taller building that's behind it And so you got the stepping away from the park. But the massing is really quite nice because, as I said, the average person on the street is saying that's really special about the building. It didn't overpower the park, steps away from the park. So I think Wright would say that's organic because it's relating to the site. And the other thing we did in the development of the architecture of the building is the corporation was transitioning from into a more, and like many companies around the country, transitioning to more and more collaborative thinking, collaborative spaces. And that building was designed to capture those concepts. So in the building design, you see this very regimented, straightforward window pattern, which is the hunker down spaces where people need to concentrate for long periods of times. And then we use the curtain wall with these kind of random mullions that suggested that collaboration is random, that you meet when you need to, you meet inadvertently at times. And we use that, pattern in the mullions, this kind of random pattern to suggest that in a way collaboration is very random, kind of needs to, it takes place when it needs to. It's not scheduled per se.
It's hopefully everyone was following the building that Mike was referring to as the Erie Insurance Tower that was just built a few years ago. Although you failed the question because you helped design it. What, if you guys, as your next chapter in life, your retirement job, if you were to get to do what I get to do every day, and you could interpret one architect, whether it's a house museum or a building, who would you be most interested in interpreting? You're the director.
What comes to mind because you mentioned retirement is Frank Gehry, because Frank Gehry claims that his career is one of the most famous architects in the world today. That his career really didn't start till after he retired. He was in the regiment of the office and the philosophy of an office, and then he retired and then started experimenting, and his artistic abilities then were released, and he moved into this kind of new section of his life. And he says he's not retiring; he's working 7 days a week, creating great architecture.
Well, I'll tag on to that, Frank Gehry. I was going to say, Cal, that architects never retire. They just keel over on the drawing board. It used to be the drawing board. Now it's the computer, I guess. But no, just to follow on what Mike was saying, I had the privilege about a year and a half ago to visit the Guggenheim in Bilbao, Spain, which is a Frank Gehry building. And I didn't know this at the time until I got there, but he designed that when he was 70. And the building has been functioning for 25 years now. And it's a beautiful building. It really turned the city around, Buildings can do that, done right and with the right kind of function and the right kind of government, they can really transform a city. And we're hoping that some of what goes on here in Erie does that as well.
I can tell you an interesting story about that. It's much like tonight, the interview, the presentation. Frank Gehry was talking about his experience with Bilbao, and he won the competition and he didn't like the site. So he was at a party in Spain, and the porch in this facility, this villa they were at, was overlooking the city, and he went out on the porch by himself, and he says, I was lamenting because I don't want to build that building there. And so the minister of the interior came out onto the porch and said, so what's going on? What do you think? What are you talking about? And they got in a conversation, and the minister asked him, well, where do you think this building should go? And he said, right down there on the river. The issue was there was two companies with warehousing that were in that spot. So they, through eminent domain, I guess, or a little bit of encouragement, they were able to get the site, and they built that building on the river. And so that building is known worldwide for the fact that it saved that city. It became such a tourist attraction, and so many people came to that city, and the city is growing from it. It came back from, from where it was at.
We've got more questions up here. I'll do a quick follow along to the Frank Gehry, and it's a good designer is a good designer, whether it's a boat, a train, a house. So I was at this maritime event last year, and there's these big mega yachts owned by the tycoons that are 300 feet long, but that's not what people were crowding around. It was a Frank Gehry designed sailboat. It was probably only about 50 feet long, but the design in this thing, I've never seen anything like it. Brilliant, brilliant design. Two questions, I guess they're interrelated. One was one of our earlier questions. Someone was curious about the durability of the terracotta on the Sullivan buildings. But then, I guess related to that question, someone else wanted to know that with the rise of the CNC machines, the ability to do laser cuts, do you see a return to more ornamentation on the buildings?
Just to take the first one, the terracotta is more fragile than stone and brick, and you do see deterioration in the terracotta. Some of it was glazed and some of it wasn't in the Sullivan buildings. In fact, the Bayard building in New York City was just restored. And they replaced a lot of terracotta in that building. And if any of you have a chance to go to Manhattan and see that building, I would highly recommend it. It's beautiful. But it does require maintenance, And the buildings move. Steel buildings move. And so you solve the problem of allowing it to move, to not crack stone or brick, but you're relying on sealant and other things to make it all work. I think whoever asked that question is right on, that we are seeing a lot more perforated metal and other types of facade treatments because there are computerized ways of creating rather inexpensively ornate details. And it could still be a modern expression or somewhat repetitive, modular, but have the kind of richness that the ornament provides. Yeah, we're seeing it.
I guess another related question, because we were talking a lot about the organic architecture inspired by nature. Do you see the green buildings of today, is that maybe a legacy from the past? And by the way, their building that they keep talking about for your insurance won a big green award. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's LEED. We're still in the final stages of getting the LEED certification, but yeah, I definitely. Mike didn't get into this specifically, but the Kahn glass plant had with the butterfly roof, allowing natural light in, also letting hot air out, and the buildings that Sullivan did, where the office buildings were rather narrow bays, and they had a significant amount of operable windows, operable sash. Definitely, we are continuing the legacy, the American architectural legacy of sustainable design. I mean, they were doing sustainable design back turn of the century, early 1900s. We kind of got out of that trend. In fact, Mike mentioned the glass box boys as, the Bauhaus and the European modern sort of came over to the U.S. We were relying on mechanical systems to keep the building cool. And we're just using energy, using electricity without thinking about the facades of the buildings and the solar orientation and the use of the site to cool. And now architects today are doing that. They're thinking about that. it's part of, the daily design opportunities. And plus technology is advancing. We've got photovoltaic panels that are extremely efficient. And so yeah, we're making progress.
Yeah, I could mention, we looked at a lot of Wright buildings tonight, right? And I had one more, but I was looking to try to illuminate some of the slides, but I don't remember the name of the house, but what I do remember is it was a house that Wright was burying into the site. So he was thinking about just about that, how to make it energy conservative. The earth is warm. How can you use, even in the winter, the earth is warmer. How could you capture that with how you could bury the house into the site? So he was thinking about those type of things.
We'll finish with a couple of Frank Lloyd Wright, and then we're at time. Someone made a comment, and they wanted everyone to know that you can stay in 2 Frank Lloyd Wright houses right over in Willoughby. And then you can also stay in a Frank Lloyd Wright house right by Kentuck Knob. So we're lucky you can have the full experience. But the final question, someone was asking if we could quantify, roughly to build a Wright house today, because he was experimenting with all these different materials. Would it be completely cost prohibitive, or you think it would be possible?
Well, that's a good question. One of the things I wanted to mention about the Susan Dana house is that that house was purchased by the state for $1 million, and they wanted to preserve it, so they made it a national state park. And it was owned by the Thompsons at the time, and they donated. They estimated about $1 million worth of Frank's furniture, because Frank designed the furniture for all these houses. In fact, he's even designed the dresses for the women to wear in his houses. I'm not sure if you guys are aware of that or not, but so that was a kind of extraordinary thing. So in doing the research, the thing that's really interesting about maybe not what the other 2 architects, but about Wright, so many of the houses are being preserved. And the folks are talking about what it's costing. It's costing $5 million to renovate these houses to bring them back to their original look. There's a lot of lost trades. They talked about there's fireplace and the Martin house that had tiles that were infused with a gold leaf. And they said it took them through the process of the renovation about 15 years to talk to different tile manufacturers and finally someone to come up with an idea that's a lost trade to recreate these tiles, which are reinstalled on the fireplace.
You mentioned the Martin house, and there's a little story that didn't get told, but when the Martin family hired Frank Lloyd Wright, this is the Buffalo house. They asked Frank, well, how much will this cost? And he told them $35,000. This was in, what was it, 1905?
1904, around.
Yeah. And so he told them 35, but they really should spend twice that so the neighbors would appreciate and admire them. What actually happened was they spent $150,000, but this was in 1904.
Yeah.
So actually, I'm involved with Lawrence Technological University in Detroit, and they own the Affleck House. They own a Bloomfield Hills Frank Lloyd Wright house right on Woodward Avenue, actually. And I've donated to that cause for restoring it. The Afflecks actually gifted it to the school. But that comes with, you got to be careful what you wish for. That comes with a price tag. So alumni and others in the architectural community have donated over $1 million to restore that house. And just this past December, the Conley family, which is a Lawrence Tech grad, donated another $1 million in a trust to try to keep the house in shape. The skylight keeps leaking. It's a Usonian house, so it's a rather modest house. But yeah, it's just they're intensely, in need of maintenance. And so I would say that it's not prohibitive if you really want a Frank Lloyd Wright house to build, and you do it with modern technology, you do it with modern materials, you insulate it. Many of the houses that Mike showed tonight are uninsulated, in a northern climate. The Affleck house has no insulation in it.
Single pane glass.
Single pane glass. But I think during that period of time, it wasn't done that much. And today you do it. But
Well, you know what Wright said about his designs? He said, if it doesn't leak, it's not a good design.
So true.
But in doing some of the research on some of the houses and renovations on the Dana house, they had to replace some of the bricks, and it's a Roman brick. So they talked about these thin, long Roman bricks. They couldn't manufacture them. They kept cracking, so they would do them like in doubles. So they'd have a fake joint on them. And so Wright was so much into this horizontality. It's really interesting that the mortar joints are recessed horizontally, and they're struck to the face on the vertical ones, so that you don't see the vertical joints as much. And so you get these continuous lines of horizontality in the building. So you'd have to do things like that. It'd be tough to sometimes remanufacture the same brick.
it's more costly.
Yeah.
Mhm.
But the other thing I found really interesting is that Wright was very involved in these projects, so he would be on site and he would select the wood pieces. So they said that they were throwing away about a third of the wood because he wanted the veining in the wood to be horizontal. So every piece selected was very strictly selected for horizontal veining in the wood. So, and it's all hardwood. So, doing that today, I think you'd have to be pretty wealthy to do all of that woodwork. But today there's veneers, so you could probably accomplish it through using veneers. And then lastly, although because Wright's thoughts about organic architecture and the Unisonian, he used plywood for the furniture. And in today's world, when you use plywood for the furniture, they like to put on the edges. Plywood has layers, right? And on the edges, they'll put a veneer to hide it. Well, Wright didn't do that. He said, I'll express those layers. They're very horizontal. And so when you look at this furniture, you see the cores of the plywood, and it's sanded, and then it's coated and stained, so it looks good. Plywood was probably made different back then too.
I'm glad Frank Lloyd Wright didn't design this roof right now. We're so lucky that the guys were able to come to town, although we miss Kim. Amazing presentation, and what you saw this evening was a sneak peek of what's to come, because what you really were hearing was a contextualized version of these three individuals, a lot of Wrights. And that's something that we at the Hagen History Center realized was missing, not just from our office, but we think is missing across the country. You visit a Wright site and it lacks the context. I don't talk a lot about the specific architecture that you're seeing at Falling Water and a little bit about Wright, but if you lack the context and the background, the story, the man, all about the organic architecture, you're only getting half of the experience. So we're going to start construction in the fall. We're going to be completed by spring, and this time next year, we'll be ready for a grand opening to unveil the country's very first museum dedicated to Wright to augment our office. It will be a museum within a museum. We're using existing space. Our architect, Jeff Kidder's here. We're working with a great design firm out of Madison, Wisconsin that has a funny name called Zebra Dog, but you'll be reading and seeing more about this in the news. But we're very excited. But thank you all again. Stay dry this evening, and thanks to our friends from Kahn.
Can I add one last comment?
Absolutely.
So the reason why maybe I was thinking, and I was reading this too, that why so many of Wright's projects are preserved is because of the Taliesin Fellowship. He trained hundreds of architects, probably thousands of architects through his fellowship, and he was very generous in that, and that he wanted to train and mentor people. And in fact, he would say, don't copy my architecture, do something new. And so he was very encouraging in that way. So I think there's this army of architects and that are relating to building owners and, departments of the state and whatnot that really push hard for the preservation of Wright's projects.
Good luck, Cal. Thank you so much.